what was the launching point for this film? How did you actually come to make this documentary?
I read a small article in the Times Art section in January of 2011 about Mark and what he'd been doing for 30 years, donating forgeries to museums all over the U.S. And they hadn't actually interviewed Mark. They talked to Matt Leininger and several of the other curators who he duped. And so I kept thinking about it and then showed it to Sam, and I called Matt, and he was great on the phone, and so we went down to Cincinnati to film with him. And then once we did that, we were like, there's a really great story here. We just have to find Mark Landis. And so once we did that, we really started shooting.
So what was that process like, though, of tracking down Mark Landis and actually getting him to agree to be in your documentary?
He was actually surprisingly open to it. We sent him our documentaries, our past films to look at, and he watched them and sort of vetted us. And then we spent a lot of time on the phone with him, like a couple hours every week, just like getting to know him. And then finally we went down in May of 2011 for the first visit.
So I know you'd mentioned there's a bit of vagueness as to who the heroes are in the film and who the villains are in the film. Was it like that for you approaching the subject? Did you sort of have a mindset of this guy's wrong or this guy's right, or did you sort of feel like you were learning a lot along the way about these people?
Yeah, I don't know that it necessarily operated that way, but I think the initial impetus for the movie was just like this crazy story. How's a guy going to have a 30-year career of being a forger and give away his forgeries? What is his motivations? And so that's really what we were after. Was he a Robin Hood? Was he trying to give art to the masses? Was he some sort of rejected, artist who was trying to get back at the art world? And, in the end, it actually was none of those things and maybe all of those things, but it became a much deeper story because the film sort of is this kind of cat and mouse art caper, but it really turns into something bigger because what Mark's motivations are really have to do with a lot of his past and his struggles with mental health.
So when you make the subject of your documentary someone who is schizophrenic and has these troubling mental health issues, does that change your process in trying to tell the story or capture the story? Are you more careful, or is it just compel you to go a little further?
I mean, I think that, part of the job of being a documentary filmmaker is to be very careful and respectful of your subjects. And I think we felt that, just as much in this process, perhaps slightly more, only because what we saw in the media and the way that he had been portrayed by the curators who he had duped was a complete, they didn't know the depth of his condition, and they didn't know really his past, and so they kind of treated him as though he were a villain. Right. With malicious intent, and really actually that was not the case. So Mark became a much more deep and complex character once you realize that those sort of classic motivations that might motivate a forger didn't apply.
Right. So what kind of crew did you use for most of this? Was it a fairly small unit? Was it mostly just the two of you? Yeah. So what are the challenges then when it's such a small operation of capturing this whole thing?
I mean, for me, I'm not a very technical person, so that was hard. But I mean, I think for this kind of story, especially because we were spending a lot of time at Mark's apartment, there was no other way to have extra people in there. Right. And so we didn't really need a bigger crew. Certainly it would have been nice to have help in other times along the process, but it's much more intimate, and I think it's just easier for sort of the access that we really wanted to get, and really getting to know Mark and Matt and Aaron and the other characters in the film.
So how long was the filmmaking process?
3 years.
Did it take you a lot of places, or did you get to stay fairly central?
It was mostly Mississippi, where Mark is, and then Cincinnati, where Matt is. And then we drove to a couple museums in the South as well. So we did some driving there. Did we? Oh, and
little bits in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Just small little forays.
Yeah. Cool. So I know you mentioned that the subjects actually got to see the documentary for the first time last night. Can you talk to me a little bit about that experience and what it was like? You mentioned you had sat behind them even.
I mean, we were nervous certainly. I mean, I think you always are, but we were very nervous and very relieved, I think, when we spoke to them afterwards, and they both loved it.
Yeah.
So that was it meant a lot to us, because I think, they were the people we were most concerned about last night.
Definitely. Yeah, nothing more to say than that, other than the fact that, I think we would have loved to have shown it to them earlier, but, they don't live in the city, and we were sort of like really just finishing the film in recent history. So it was a nice moment to do it all together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.